Hey, class. This lecture is to help you all get ready for your exam that you're going to have on Friday. Uh, the focus of that exam is going to be chapters 16, 18, and 20. Now, the reason why I'm focusing on these chapters is that these chapters primarily talk about West Africa, although they do mention Southern Africa and Eastern Africa a little bit, but they focus a lot on West Africa. And these chapters look at the period of about 60 years, from say the 1820s onward up until the 1880s, when you until 1884 or so, when you have the scramble for Africa. Now, the reason why I'm focusing on these chapters in particular is that next week we're going to start reading the book Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, which is a novel, a historical novel that looks at Eastern Nigeria at the beginning of the colonial era. And so these chapters dealing with actual history should allow you to kind of understand the perspectives of everybody better than you would have if you just read the book cold. Well, by the time you get to 1820, Africa, especially West Africa, had been in regular contact with the West for about 400 years. Now, having said that, regular contact with the West pretty much was only meant that there was a regular trading contact. Now, of course, the most valuable trade item in West Africa from the 1400s until about 1800 were slaves. And this was especially true, I'd say, from about 1650 on, or about 1600 onward, because sugar had become a very, very valuable commodity in Europe. And the Western Hemisphere, from Brazil through the Caribbean, as far north as Louisiana and Florida in North America, were ideal places for growing sugar. And Africans were brought in to do that. And there were a couple of reasons why Africans were brought in. First of all, there were reasons in the Americas. The Native American population had been very isolated from human populations in the Eastern Hemisphere, in Africa, Asia, and Europe for thousands of years. And so when Europeans came to the Americas and came in contact with Native Americans, at least for about the first couple of generations, died in huge numbers. I mean, there was a huge decline in the Native American population. In some places, like the Caribbean, Native Caribbean people became almost extinct. In a lot of the Caribbean places, a lot of the Caribbean islands, indigenous Caribbean people really don't exist anymore. On the mainland, people managed to survive, but populations really dropped. And in this environment, there was a move to bring in Africans. Now, Europeans were familiar with African slavery from a couple of sources. The primary one being the Muslim world, in particular Spain and Portugal, which were the first two countries to really establish colonies in the Americas. Both of those countries had been ruled by the Muslims, during the Middle Ages. Portugal was ruled until about 1260, 1280, somewhere in that area. And Spain and parts of Spain were ruled until 1492, the very year that Columbus went to the Americas. And because of this interaction with the Muslim world, they were familiar with African slaves, because the Muslims in Northern Africa and the Middle East had been engaged with the slave trade in Africa for a long time. Now, the other thing, too, is that Africans, being from the Eastern Hemisphere, were immune to pretty much the same diseases as Europeans. As a matter of fact, they had some advantages because they were immune to malaria, not immune, but they were resistant to malaria and yellow fever, major tropical diseases. Also, Africans had long traditions of farming and grew certain crops that were valuable to Europeans. Like, for instance, in a place like South Carolina or in Georgia, uh, a lot of times slaves were bought from the area known as the Upper Guinea Coast, the area of what nowadays is Sierra Leone, Liberia, Senegal, the Upper Guinea Coast, yeah, because these were areas where people grew a lot of rice, and rice was the original export crop in South Carolina, and also in the Low Country in Georgia, in the east, the coastal area of Georgia. Well, anyway, I don't want to get too deep into that. What we see is that slavery, as I said, in the 17th century in particular, from the late 1600s on to the 1700s, really becomes a huge uh, business because of sugar. And the British emerge as the biggest slave traders of all. Now, the irony of this, however, is that all the money that was used to develop that was made off of the slave trade was used to develop industrialization in Europe. Over a period of time, technology and demand for certain goods like textiles, uh, along with growing efficiency in farming in Europe, meant that you had a rural population that no longer was needed, so they moved to the cities. And you had demand for items like porcelain. You had demand for items like cotton, for cotton textiles. And eventually, this was solved by engineers doing research and creating machinery that allowed for mass production of items. And that was what was known as the Industrial Revolution. And so once you have the Industrial Revolution, this really begins to undermine the profitability of the slave trade. Frankly, Europeans could make more money, British could make more money doing industrial work or investing in industry than they could investing in the slave trade. Now, the other thing, too, is that you have a beginning of a change in political philosophy in Europe. More people looking towards individual freedom, the idea that humans are equal. And in this kind of environment, you really see a move away from supporting slavery. I mean, those of you all who have Christian backgrounds may know the story of Amazing Grace, which is a famous gospel hymn. It was written by a British slave trader who, during a storm, had a revelation about slavery and felt it was wrong and wrote Amazing Grace. He became an abolitionist. And so what we see is at the same time an industry is developing and you're seeing people begin to talk about freedom and equality. You see an abolitionist movement developing. Now, this would have a significant impact on Africa because over time this would mean that there would be less of a demand for slaves to be bought from Africa. Now, I think it's important to understand that Europeans didn't actually have to go into Africa in any large numbers and capture slaves. There was a marketing structure or commercial structure in Africa in which people sold slaves. Now, one of the things that students often bring up is, how could these Africans sell each other? How could blacks sell blacks? Well, you really have to understand that people in Africa didn't see them, being black was not a defining characteristic for Africans. I mean, everybody in Africa, it was in sub-Saharan Africa was black, essentially. I mean, it's just like if you were in Sweden and you met somebody and you were trying to describe them to somebody else, chances are you wouldn't say, well, it was a white guy that spoke Swedish. I mean, that's like 98% of the population. It wouldn't be a big deal. I mean, if you're in Nigeria right now, if you were trying to describe somebody else, a local person you met to somebody else, you probably wouldn't say, well, they probably say, what do he look like? Well, he's black. Yeah, 220 million people in Nigeria are black. I mean, that's not exactly something that's going to stick out. And so the point I'm driving at is that Africans tended to define themselves in terms of ethnicity, like what language they spoke, what religion they practiced, who their political leaders were. Those were the defining characteristics. And the people that they enslaved, generally speaking, were not members of their communities, unless they were criminals who had committed crimes and they were being sold into slavery as a punishment. And so what we see is that in Africa, people who were in a weaker position got captured and were often sold into slavery. Like, for instance, in the beginning of chapter 16, it talks about Islamic jihads in Western Sudan. And it talks about development of Islamic states in the interior of Western Africa. The kingdoms of Sokoto, Messina, Fudajalan, and Fudatoro that went, all the way from Senegambia in the west over to what nowadays would be eastern Nigeria and Niger, Cameroon, and Chad in the east. Now, what we see here is that Islam, which had been, coming into Africa for 1,000 years by this time, over 1,200 years. I mean, Islam initially comes into Africa in the 600s, after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, and Arabs leave Arabia and bring their new religion, Islam, with them. Islam was attractive to a lot of Africans for a lot of reasons. It was a religion that would connect them to a worldwide political, religious, and economic network. It was a religion that had a written language. It was a religion that had its own legal code, the Sharia. The thing in the West, a lot of times when people hear about the Sharia, they hear about somebody getting their hand cut off, or they hear about polygamy. But the thing about the Sharia is that the Sharia is a law code that really covers all kinds of things. Trade law, inheritance law, taxation. And so, if you're a ruler and you begin to learn about Islam, you realize that there's a great deal in Islam that could actually help you have a more efficient country. And also, Islam would be a way to unify people. And so what we see in West Africa is that, certain groups of people begin to look at Islam. In particular, they mentioned the Fulani, a Fulbe people. These were herders who lived in Western Africa. They looked a little different from other people. The Fulani of Fulbe tended to be a little bit fairer skinned, a little bit straighter hair. They were mixed with people from further north in Africa. Now, those features can be exaggerated. I mean, by American standards, Fulani people, look like, kind of brown. Most of them look like brown-skinned black folks who, I hate to use this term, who have, especially what African Americans might often refer to as good hair, hair that's not quite as kinky as mine, maybe a little wavier, that'll get them a bigger, bushier afro than I have, that kind of thing. But basically, these people were herders who lived among farmers. And there's always conflict between herders and farmers because they both want to use the same land, but they want to do different things with it. Herders want to have their animals go across it. Farmers want to raise their crops. And quite often, herd animals will eat the crops of farmers. And so the farming communities, they tended to be the ones that were most organized. And so they tended to penalize the Fulani. And so what we see is that among these people, leaders began to rise up among them. And so we see people, for instance, like Usman Dan Fodio, who rise up and begin to organize their people around Islam, saying that, they were true Muslims, that other people, like, for instance, in the case of the Hausa city-states, these people were Muslim already, but they would argue these people weren't really good Muslims. And so they said that gave them the right to come in and get control. So they used Islam to get control. And I'm not saying these people weren't sincere. I believe these leaders were sincere Muslims. I'm not saying that they didn't actually believe the religion. Quite the opposite. I believe they very strongly believed in it. But they used Islam as a way to help them organize their people and gain power. Now, one of the byproducts of this, however, is that there were people being captured, and one of the ways to get rid of enemies, and in particular, in this part of the world, was to sell them. And so wars quite often sold people. Now, the irony here is that the wars going on in the African interior at this time. This was in the period from about 1820 to about 1880 or so. This was by this time there was already a significant decline in the international slave trade. But these wars did allow for a consolidation of government. And so what we see is that by the time you begin to see an increasing European presence in the interior of Africa, especially in the area of what would become Senegal in the 1850s, the French, they were the Europeans who came into Senegal, they found themselves dealing with organized governments that had a lot of military capacity and who were familiar with guns. And so therefore it was pretty tough going to get control of these territories. And this was the case, further to the east when the British go into Nigeria. And so one of the things I want you to understand is that at the same time Europeans eventually go into Africa, they're running into African societies that are moving in a direction of larger and more organized political states based on Islam in the interior of Africa. And later on, that's something that Europeans use to their advantage. That's something that we're going to see when we read the book on Darfur. Now, we're not going to see that in the book Things Fall Apart, but in the second book, we're going to see that. Well, anyway, I'm going to stop this lecture because if I make them too long, it takes too long for them to convert. And I'm going to talk about the coast of Africa in the next lecture. Anyway, you all take care, and I hope these lectures are useful to you.